Hey folks, this is Cindy. Thanks so much for joining me. In today's video, I'm going to be coloring in the Power Poppy Miraculous Mushroom digital stamp. I thoroughly enjoyed coloring this project in. It was a nice change from my usual florals, and overall, the shapes were fairly simple. This was pretty easy to color in. And I really just enjoyed the finished results of this. I have this printed out on Expressive Blending card. This is cut down to 8 inches by 8 inches. It is going to be going into a frame with a 5 by 5 inch mat. And I made sure that my lines were light enough that as I color this in, they're going to disappear so I could get some no line coloring out of this. And the first thing I'm going to start coloring in here is this center mushroom cap. I'm starting with the BV20. This is going to be what's going to help get my darkest shade color. I'm only going to be using 2 colors of red here in order to color this in. So by bringing in this BV20, I can get to that darker desaturated red that I'm looking for without trying to find a darker red that would ultimately alter my desired finished color here. I do want a more of a reddish orange in this. There are some of these mushrooms in the species that actually have a really nice, lovely, cool red to them. And then there's other ones that have a warmer red to them. And I was going for that warmer red look. So in order to get that, I need to start with this BV20. I would not go with the BV23 with this blending combination, folks, on these mushrooms. I did test that out and it was way too dark, especially once you bring in the colored pencils. So that is why I settled on the BV20. I'm just taking this BV20 and I'm going right around the edge of it first. I'm ignoring all of the warts that are in the center of this mushroom for the time being. I'm just as much on the tip of my marker as I can get. Now, if I were doing this off camera, I would actually be further up on the tip of my marker, but I was trying to get it off to the side enough that you could actually see what I'm doing for a change. I am trying to make sure that I address that issue going forward. So I did make sure that I was kind of still up on the tip of my marker there, but far enough over that you folks can see what's going on. Again, I'm just going to go around the perimeter here. I do draw myself a little bit of a fence there, and then I bring it in a little bit. I am being pretty conservative with this. You could probably bring it in just a wee bit further. This still worked out just fine. However, I feel like if you brought this BV20 in just a fraction further, you would get a much more rounded shape at the end, but that's okay. We'll address that here in a bit. Once I'm done with the perimeter of this cap, now I'm going to come back in and add the cast shadow of these little warts here. Now, I have this blown up to 150% of the default size. That extra 50% makes a huge difference. These would actually be pretty small at default size, and it could be a little tricky. That extra 50% gives me just a little bit more room to get in there and get just along the edge of those warts without actually coloring over the top of them. You don't want to lose them. They are placed very well, and I think that if you colored over the top of one and you lost that shape, it would definitely stand out. So you do want to make sure that you're not coloring over the top of any of them. I looked at a reference photo of these mushrooms. Now, they're actually a pretty popular mushroom in all sorts of culture and art and literature and all sorts of things. But I'd never actually taken a really good look at one. So I did look at a reference photo, and it is surprising how far up those warts stand up on these mushrooms. And that's what they're called. They're called warts. So they actually do have quite a bit of a cast shadow to them. So that is why I was adding that BV20 to them. And if you look at this illustration, you can see where Marcella had illustrated the lines that would indicate those cast shadows. So I followed those lines and I made sure that I got that BV20 in there. Now I'm coming in with my R17 and I'm going to go right over the top of that BV20 and I'm going to bring it out just a little bit from these warts, not too much, but just a little bit. I'll bring it out just a little bit more along the perimeter of the mushroom cap. I have a little bit more room to do that there. Now, when I bring this in from the edge of the cap next to some of these warts, it's going to fill that space in. So you're not going to have any white space left between them. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. You're still going to see the difference in the color there, and that's how it would look naturally anyways. You're not always going to have that white space left, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's still going to look right in the end. Now, again, I am up here on the cap of my marker, more so on this one than I was with that BV20, primarily because this is a red marker. And I don't want to color inside those warts with this red marker because then I have to try to get that out of there. You have a couple of options when coloring in these warts. I've seen photos where the warts themselves are actually fairly white. There is not a whole lot of color in them. And I've also seen reference photos, which is the one that I went off today, where they do have a very light brown shade to them. I'm going to go with more of the light brown shade instead of the white. But regardless, I want to make sure that I'm not getting this red on the inside of those. I don't want to have to try to get it out of there. I won't get it out of there 100%, and then I'll have red warts instead of light brown warts or white warts. So I know that you can't see what I'm doing here. I'm doing the same thing that I did with a BV20. I'm just up further on the tip of that marker there. So I have quite a bit more control of what I'm doing. And I also want you to take note of where my fingers are at on this marker. Look how far down on the barrel they are. I am right down in there. So I'm not giving the marker itself a lot of play in my hand. So I can control it that much further. This is really simple coloring, folks, but it is time consuming. This is not a process that you want to rush. And I know typically I talk about making sure that you're working at least fast enough that your marker stays wet in that paper. So when you move on to your next color, you're going to get to that blend. This is not one of those images that you need to concern yourself with that. Take your time. I mean, you obviously don't want to take forever, but do take your time. The quality is going to count the most here. You're still going to get a good enough blend. I mean, these warts kind of break up that surface enough that you wouldn't, visually, you're not going to get anything solid out of this in the end, but you are going to make sure at the very least that you're not coloring over the tops of things that you don't want to color over the top of, and then you can't fix it later and then your image is ruined anyways. Hopefully that makes sense. The bottom line, take your time on this, folks. It is totally okay. It's easy enough to do. Just take your time doing it. When I am done with that R17, I'm going to come in with the R14. I'm going to go right over the top of the BV20 and that R17. This is where it's going to feel like it gets a little bit trickier yet, because now you have to finish coloring in the rest of that white space, and you have to get up and around the rest of those warts. So you need to finish coloring in that around that shape. So what I'm doing, and I found that this was a little bit easier after doing some test colors on a separate image, I found it was easier to go around, finish coloring in around the wart, and then fill in that space that was left between the warts afterwards. Hopefully you can see what I'm doing here and it'll make more sense to you. Again, I'm not worried about getting a good blend on this. Now, what I am going to look at is I'm going to make sure that I have the depth of color that I want on this. Right now, I'm looking at this area that I've already colored in, and I know that it's already dried back fairly well, and it's looking a wee bit too light for my taste. So I am going to come back in and I'm gonna kind of reinforce some of those areas with the R17, and then I'm going to go over the top of them again with this R14. R14 will not lift up R17 too terribly much. And typically, I would tell you not to continue to go over your colors, because even though Copics are transparent, when you go over the top of the same color that you've just done, you're making it darker. In this case, I did want to push it a little bit darker. I am really happy with this warm undertone of these colors. I love that. I just want a little bit more depth out of it, a little bit darker. So I am going to go over it again so I can get that color out of that. So I let it sit for a moment or two. I'm taking a peek at it, and then I decided, yep, I want to go just a little bit darker. I need a little bit more of this R17 down there at the bottom of that cap. I see some of those warts aren't quite dark enough in that cast shadow area, so I'm going to add a little bit more there. I want a little bit more around the edge of this cap so I can get that more rounded shape. I could definitely do that with my colored pencils, but in this case it doesn't hurt to do that with my markers, so I might as well while I'm in there. And I'm very specifically not coming in again with that BV20. Layering more of that BV20 in there is just going to push that a little too dark for me. And again, I know that I'm going to be coming in again with my colored pencils, so I don't need to get quite that much color down in my Copic coloring. Yes, I want it a little bit darker because I know how much of this is still going to be showing through it when I'm done with my colored pencils, but I don't need to push it quite that far with my Copics alone. So once I was done with that R17, now I'm coming back in with the R14. And actually, now that I have all of my colors down, I have all of that placement done. So I have a little bit more freedom to come in just a wee bit more recklessly with my marker. But again, folks, I will caution you, make sure that you're not coloring over the top of those warts. Getting a red marker out of your paper is not always easy to do, and sometimes you can't do it. All right, so I'm moving over to this little button down here. This is leaning more towards us. However, the bottom portion of the button cap is actually going to have quite a bit of shade to it. So I'm going to come in pretty heavy with that BV20 down there. Again, right up underneath those warts. Take a look at this illustration, folks. You can see exactly where those lines are drawn. Now, I also noted when I started coloring this in that there are some spots that are illustrated in the image itself. Those are actually the spores that are on the mushroom cap. Those are actually a part of the mushroom cap. However, I noticed when I was doing my research on these mushrooms that you can't see all of them. So I decided to ignore them in the end. But what you could do when you're done coloring all of these in and you're working on your colored pencils, you could actually go in with a very thin or very fine white gel pen, and you could actually tap in those little white spores in there, and that would look pretty cool. You would want to do just like a very single quick tap, just a very fine dot in those areas, and it would look pretty groovy. I just decided to skip it altogether, and it's not a big deal. So I color a lot of florals. I color a lot of florals, and it's not that I don't know how to color in anything else. I really, really enjoy coloring in florals. However, occasionally it's really nice to step outside of that floral bubble and do something different. But even with all of my experience in coloring, I still have those moments where I start to color something else and I look at it and I almost feel like I have completely forgotten how to color. It's almost like I'm telling myself, I can't color this in. It's not a flower. It's not florals. I can't do this. I don't know how to do this. So then I have to remind myself that it's not that I can't color it in. It's not that I've forgotten how to color. Nothing's changed but the image itself. So generally the best way I have found to get out of that is, well, for starters, just simply diving right in. I'm doing the same techniques. I mean, there's nothing different here, folks. I'm doing the same flicking motions that I always do. The color theory is the same. It's just a different shape. So aside from just diving in and coloring in the project. Another trick that I have found that works really well for me is to do my research on whatever it is that I'm going to color. So I recognize fly agaric mushrooms. They're very popular all over their literature, art. They've been around since the beginning of time. They're very popular style of mushroom because look at them. I mean, they're darling. They're very aesthetic. I actually didn't know a whole lot about them, so I went and did my research on them before I started coloring these in. So not only did I become more excited about the subject itself, these are actually a very fascinating species of mushrooms, but I became more familiar with them as a mushroom. So I really took the time to look at the different colors and learn about what everything means on these mushrooms and the properties of these mushrooms. So I was a little bit more invested in it, and therefore I felt a little bit more confident in what I was going to do to color these in. So that's just kind of something that works for me. Maybe that's something that'll work for you as well. But at the end of the day, what I want you guys to remember is it's okay to switch it up. It is okay to take on new things that you may or may not be familiar with. You can still do it. You just may need to take a different approach to it, and that's totally fine. And I actually found that coloring in this project was quite a bit easier than some of the florals that I've done in the past. And it was just so darling. Like, I can't even stand how cute these mushrooms were. So I'm going to finish up this cap here. It is the same thing that I have done on the other two caps. This one is kind of tilted back in a different direction. Do take note on how the lines are illustrated in this. It seems counterintuitive on where you're going to put some of these cast shadows because of the direction that it's facing, but trust the illustration on this, folks. So the lines for the cast shadow on those warts, so those actually come down towards the left, towards you, towards your eye. You would think that they would be going in the other direction, but they actually wouldn't, because this cap is tilted away. You wouldn't actually see any cast shadow on the other side of it. It would be towards you. And also remember, those warts stick up quite a bit, so they're going to cast some of that shadow towards you as well. Okay, so now I'm ready to start coloring in the stems here. I am going to split these stems, this stem, up into thirds. I'm going to start at this upper portion. I'm putting this E43 up underneath where that cap meets that stem. It would have quite a bit of a cast shadow there. And then right along where the skirt meets up with that stem, just a very thin line right there. I did not bring that out at all. I'm going to go over the top of that E43 with this E41, and I'm going to make sure that this is nice and saturated. I'm going in pretty heavy with that 41 over that 43, and then I'm going to finish it off with the 40. Now notice I did not go over that 43 with that 40. The 40 will eat up quite a bit of the 43, but the 41 isn't too terribly harsh over the 43. Hopefully that makes sense. So now I'm going to get some of this 43 up underneath that skirt there. It's also called a ring, so I added it up underneath there, brought that down a little bit along the edges. And then there's portions of the stem that look like they are separated from the stem itself. In all of my research, I didn't find a name for this. It just looks as how... It's just kind of how the stem grows, where there's like these portions that are separated from the stem itself, and there is a little bit of shade in those. So I am adding the 43 in there, and I'm going to kind of build that up to give those a little bit more texture and a little bit more shade as I go along here. Now I noticed that I was a little light here up where this stem it meets up with that skirt, so I just brought that 41 in just a tiny bit there, not too much. Now I'm coming back in with that 41 over that 43. Here's where we are up underneath that skirt. It does stick out a little ways, so it is going to have quite a bit of cast shadow on that stalk itself. And then I'm going to start building this up in these areas where there is that separation in the stem. So again, I'm going to go over the top of that 43. I'm going to bring this 41 out a little bit. Some of these I'm going to go straight across. Some of them I will get right up there at the tip of my marker as I come to the center of that stem, and I'll just kind of stipple that on these very fine dots, and then I'll call it good with that. Now I am going to make sure that I have this 43 and 41 built up pretty well here at the bottom of it where the stem actually meets the ground. There's going to be quite a bit of shade in that area. That ground isn't going to have any light that reflects up on to the stem, so it's going to be a little bit darker in that area. So that is why I made sure to add that 43 and that 41 pretty heavy there. Again, just like I had done before, when I'm done with that 41 and that 43, then I'm going to come in with my E40. I am not spending a whole lot of time going over the top of that 43 with this 40. However, I did lose some of my 41 in there, so I'm going to have to come back in with my 41 and re-add that. That's fine. This paper is still pretty wet. I can see it. I can see by how dark it is. It's still wet enough that I can come in with that 41, go into that 43, bring it out where it meets up with that 40, and it's going to do the rest of that blending all by itself. I also see some of these separated areas in the stem where I can make those just a little bit darker too, so I am going to concentrate in those areas so I can really get the texture in this stem. I actually really, that was one of my favorite things when I look at reference photos of this mushroom. I love that texture down there. I don't know what it is. All right, so now I'm ready to start working on the skirt here, and I want to make it look like it does have some folds and movement in it. They don't actually have a whole lot in any of the reference photos I saw, so I'm gonna kind of over exaggerate this a little bit because I like the way it looks, and that's just fine. So again, I'm starting with this 43, and I'm looking at the illustration, and I can see where there's those dips in the edge of those lines themselves. Now I want you to note that I did not go right up to the very edge of those lines, and there is a reason why I'm going to leave that. On some fly agaric mushrooms, they have like a green tint to the edge of that skirt. Some of them don't. Some of them are just a plain white. Some are a little on the yellow side. I saw some that were a little on the reddish brown side. I really loved the contrast to that green, so I decided to go with that. I thought it tied in really well to that grass. And plus it's right here in the center of my image, so it's just enough pop of color that it stands out enough that you see it, but not so much that it's too much. I started with the YG21 and completely colored that area in. Now this is the YG03, and I'm just going down in those areas that would be a little bit darker, so it kind of butts up right up against that E43 there. Then I'm going to go back over it one more time with the YG21. I'm also going to go over the top of this with that E40. That's going to kind of knock back some of the brightness of the green. It'll mute it just a little bit so it doesn't stand out quite so stark, and that's actually a perfect color. I didn't want to go with the green over the brown, but that lighter brown over this green is just perfect. So I'm going to start coloring in the stem on this button mushroom right here. And this is actually going to have quite a bit of shade in it because it is leaning towards us. So there's actually quite a bit of shadow being casted over the top of that stem itself. Plus it's a little bit shorter, so there wouldn't be as much light getting to this anyway as opposed to that taller one. So I'm going to go in a little bit heavier here with that E43. I made sure I got right up underneath that cap, and again I have those areas that are kind of lifted up away from that stem, and I'm going to really build those up. This one's going to feel like it has more texture to it than the one in the middle does because not as much light is getting to it as the other one. And it's the same thing. E43, go in with that E41, then finish that off with the E40. I noticed there on that center one, for some reason, I didn't color right up next to the edge. So I wanted to try something on these, and it's totally not necessary at this point. You could skip this if you would like. I wanted to see if I could add just a little bit more texture to these. And so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to be stippling some texture in. I'm coming back in with this E43. I'm going in to those darker shaded areas and shadows where I had that E43 originally. I'm right up there on the tip of my marker as much as possible so you can see it. And I'm just adding these series of dots. Now, at the end of the day, once I'm done with the colored pencil work on them, you're not really going to see this, folks, but I definitely wanted to test it out and see what I could do with it. So I'm going to finish walking you through this, but if you want to skip it again, that's totally fine. At this point, it's not necessary. So I'm going in with this E43 in those darker areas. I'm not going in super duper heavy. Like, I'm not trying to completely cover that area up at all. Now I'm coming in with that E41. I am going over the top of those dots with the E4 that I had done with the E43 as well, and bringing that out a little bit, not too much. Again, I wasn't 100% certain how this was going to turn out, and I suspected that once I brought in the colored pencils, you wouldn't see it anyways, but it was kind of fun to do it and see what was going to happen with it. When I'm done with this E41, I am going to bring in a little bit of the E40. Now, you're not going to see much of that E40 because it is so light, and we would be going into those lighter areas anyways. Once this dries back, it's barely going to be noticeable. You can kind of see it, and it's kind of groovy. If you were to skip the colored pencil portion of this, if you didn't do colored pencils at all, this would be a really awesome way to get some of that texture, some more texture into it. Now, on fly agaric mushrooms, they don't have this texture on them anyways, so it doesn't really matter. But I wanted to see what it would look like. So that's that. Another thing that I'd like to note real quick is fly agaric mushrooms, their stems are actually pretty white. They have just barely a tint of brown in them. Overall, if you do a quick glance at their stems, they're pretty white. I'm taking this darker than what they really are in real life, and I'm making a very clear choice to do that. I liked the idea of them being darker. I knew that when I was done coloring in my project that it would be better suited to go with a little bit darker brown than trying to keep it lighter or more on the white side. Also, when I was testing out my colors, I did test out a few lighter colors that would work. They would be a little bit closer to what fly agaric stems look like in real life. I just wasn't sold on it. I knew it kind of came back to my finished project. I knew once it was finished, they wouldn't blend in that well. And you're going to actually see more of what I'm talking about here soon when I get to coloring in this ground. I go in with that much darker ground, and I wasn't 100% sold on the contrast of a lighter stem and that deeper, darker ground color that I chose, or the colors for the ground that I chose. So this was kind of a happy medium here. You still get the idea that these are fly agarics, but they're not super realistic, and that's okay. That is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with doing it that way. All right, so I'm just going to finish up this stem like I did the other two, but take a note of those other two stems, folks. Look how far back that stippling dried. That's not a big deal. Again, I knew that this was just going to be a test, and I knew that at the end of the day, I wasn't going to be able to see it through my colored pencil work anyways, so that's fine. But I did want to make sure that there was some continuity to all three of these, just in case some of this did kind of show through some of the colored pencil work. I still need to finish up underneath the cap of that mushroom, but honestly, I was finishing up that stem and I looked at the grass and went, ooh, grass, let's color that next. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with the B34. This is going to help me get to those darker shaded areas in this grass. And I got to be honest, folks, this grass is pretty thin. These are pretty fine, even blown up to 150%. I suggest that you get right up there on the tip of that marker to add this blue in there, to add all of the colors in there. This doesn't have to be perfect, but you definitely don't want these lines to be super duper fat. In most cases, I am literally just flicking it up as close to the edge of that grass blade as I can possibly get it. If it goes outside of the lines, it's not a big deal. At the end of the day, when I'm done coloring this in, we're just going to have the illusion of blades of grass. They're not going to be detailed. And that serves the purpose of this project fine anyways. It doesn't have to have a whole bunch of detail in order for you to get the idea of what it is. So I'm going right up the edge of those as close as I can possibly get it, staying up there on the tip of my marker most of the time. I do kind of tilt it off to the side occasionally because I do want you guys to see what I'm doing. I start at the base of that blade of grass and then I flick my way up. You can see right here what I'm doing with the YG17. I had done the same thing with the B34, but now I'm starting to fill in those blades much more. In most of them, I color them in completely just by simply the stroke of the tip of that marker. It is just fat enough that it's almost impossible to leave any white space, and that's okay. If I leave a white space on some of them, that's fine. If I don't, that's fine too. I'm still going to bring in my lighter color anyways, and it's all going to work out in the end. Now, did you notice that I flicked up on that one really tall and it colored over the top of the cap of that mushroom? I am going to fix that. You don't necessarily need to. If you're close enough, you don't necessarily need to. It's just going to look like a tall blade of grass. I fix it because I don't care for it that much. It really bothers me. But here's the problem. I'm going over the top of my background color as well as that YG17 with that colorless blender. So I did kind of work out some of that B60 that I had used on that background. So if you want to leave it, if you've done all of that work and you want to leave it, by all means, leave it. Now I'm coming in with the YG03 and I am finishing off those blades of grass, but I'm also adding extra flick strokes here and there in between the blades of those grass to help make this look fuller. This is where I'm talking about it gives the illusion of grass, not necessarily the detail of grass. At the end of the day, I do want to make sure that that B34 is covered up, so that is another reason why I bring that in there. I also bring in the YG03 and the YG17 along the edges there so I can get some shorter strokes in there. It'll make it look fuller too, but you don't want all of your blades of grass to be the same length. Okay, so now I'm going to start working on the ground here. I'm starting with the E29 and I'm doing that stippling again. So I have my brush kind of tipped off to the side, or my marker, I'm sorry, tipped off to the side a little bit, but you need to be right up there on the tip of that marker in order to get the best effect. This will still work, but up there on that tip is so much better. So I'm just going along the bottom edges of those mushrooms and adding that E29 in there. I'm not completely filling it in. There's still plenty of gaps in there, and I'm not bringing it out too far. I just kind of followed the shape of the image here. When I was done with that E29, I'm bringing in the E25, and I'm going to go right over the top of the E29 and start filling some of that in. The E25 is also going to help blend some of that E29, knock it back just a wee bit, but I'm also going to bring this out a little bit further. Now, occasionally when I'm doing this, if I see an opportunity to bring out a stray dot, I do that. I will tell you that this is kind of something that it kind of takes a little bit of practice to get the feel for it. So don't get discouraged. It seems super easy. It actually is super easy. You just kind of need to get a feeling for what the finished look is going to be at the end because you're doing it in dots. It feels strange. So don't get discouraged with that. When I was done with the E25, I came in with the E23 again. I went over the top of the 29 and the 25, brought that out a little bit. You can see more of those stray dots that I had just talked about with that 23. When I'm done with that 23, I have the E21. I'm going in and I'm going over the top of all of my colors at this point. This will be my lightest color. This is what I'm going to fade the ground out into this white paper. So I need to go over the top of everything, and I'll bring this out quite a bit further. See those stray dots that I'm talking about right now? I just kind of look at it and decide, Should I add one there? Should I leave it? You kind of can't go wrong with it, but you don't want to go crazy with it, is the best way I can put that. I will spend more time on this with the E21 than I did the other colors, because while I want dots, I want a blended dots. That stippling needs to be a little bit on the blended side. And this E21 gets me to that point. I also made sure that I brought it up just a tiny bit onto those stems so there wasn't that disconnect between the two, because remember, these mushrooms are growing out of the ground, so they need to look like they're growing out of the ground. So now I'm ready to work underneath this cap here, and I'm going to use a peach Stettler fine liner pen to go over the lines on the gills of this cap. This is actually going to give me a little bit of definition in those gills. A Copic marker would be too fat. You could definitely do this with a colored pencil. However, when I was testing out my color swatches on this, I found that going in with the pen first actually gave you just a little bit more realistic texture under there. Now, some of the reference photos I looked at, these gills could get pretty dark underneath here. I wasn't completely sold on that, given all of the other colors that I had, or all of the other coloring that I had done up until this point. So that's why I chose the peach, and it actually works really well underneath those E markers that we used to color in those stems, because we're going to use the same colors to color this cap. If you want to go just a wee bit darker on the brown side, yes, you can do that. And I mean just a wee bit darker. I would not go with anything orange, anything more on the orange side than this peach. I did try those, and it was way too much. It looked wrong. It just didn't look right at all. When I was done with the Stettler, I bring back that E43. I need to get where the stem meets that cap, so I'm adding the shading there. Notice that I'm not doing any of that shading in front of the stem. I'm keeping it off to the side there. I am, for the most part, following the shapes of those gills. And I'm taking it so it looks like it's coming out the back. I do need some of this E43 where that skirt is blocking that that cap. It's going to have just a little bit of darkness and shade in that area. And then I'm also going to bring this E43 where the top of the cap meets the bottom of the cap just a little bit. I end up knocking this back just a little bit more than what I have colored in here. That was too much. So by the time I bring in my E41 and my E40, I push back that E43 quite a bit, so it's not quite so dark up underneath this portion of the cap. It's kind of hard to see here in the video, but in real life, I can actually see that Stettler underneath these browns. It's a really good blend under there. It gets me the crisp lines of those gills, but they don't stand out like sore thumbs, and that's perfect. That's exactly what I wanted. And it's also a really good reason why you should test your colors before you actually start a project. So when I was done with that E43, I brought in that 41. I did use that 41 to kind of bring some of that shade there at the front of the stem where it meets that cap, but not a whole lot. When I was done with the 41, then I come back in with my E40 and I call it good. I couldn't find any reference photos where there would be any major contrast between underneath the cap and the stem, although I know that there are other species of mushrooms that the stems and underneath the caps are different colors. So I got so busy knocking back all of that E43 up underneath the lip of that cap there that I need to come back and add just a little bit more. I definitely want this to look like that stem is pushing up underneath the bottom of this cap. So I definitely want to make sure that there's plenty of shade there, that it goes pretty dark up underneath there. So I came back in with my 43. Now I'll come back in with my 41 again. I'll go over the top of that 43, but I'm going to be a little bit more conservative this time. I don't need to go out of my way to get rid of the same amount of 43. I just put it back in there. So I need to make sure that I keep as much as I possibly can at this point. So now it's time to color in the warts on our mushrooms. I've already done the center one there, and I'll show you how I do it here on this little button. I'm taking the E11 and I'm literally just dotting it right in the center of these, and they're not perfect and they're not consistent. So some of them I might move a little off center, some of them I just go right down to the center of it. I'm just kind of getting it on there. I don't want to color in the entire thing or the entire wart with the E11, just a little bit of shade in those. Fly agarics, the warts on fly agarics aren't smooth, so they have like a little dip in them, and the light catches just enough shade in that. So I'm making sure that I get just enough shade on these that you can actually see that they have that texture in them. When I'm done with that, then I'm going to go right over the top of them with the E50. And at this point, I'm just coloring it in. In fact, I'm not really paying a whole lot of attention to getting them colored in. As long as it's colored in its entirety, that's all I care about. It doesn't have to be perfect. I am trying to make sure that I don't go too far into that red because I don't want to drag the red into the wart. I worked really hard to keep it out of there, but outside of that, it's actually pretty easy. I'm just getting the color on there and then I'll call it good. And I am ready to start bringing in my colored pencils, and I'm going to start on these caps. I am bringing in the Prismacolor in dark purple. I'm going in where I would have had that BV20. Look how sharp my pencil is. At this point, I am going to make sure that I continue to keep that pencil super sharp. I want these lines up next to the warts super crisp. Also, I want to have as much control as possible with this dark purple. I don't want to go too crazy with it. You cannot control where the pencil is going if it's dull. So in order to keep that control, in order to get the color down where I want it, I need to make sure that it's nice and sharp. And also I'm going to be using this dark purple along the edge of the cap of the mushroom. And I don't want this dark purple going into my background here. So if I keep my pencil nice and sharp, I can get those lines nice and clean. I'll just take that pencil and I'll kind of run it along the edge there, and then in very tight circular motions, I'll bring that out just a little bit. You could probably bring it out again a little bit further than what I have done here, but I was going a little on the conservative side. You could probably go a little bit darker, further in the cap of this mushroom than what I did. And I'm also making sure that I have a very light hand. I'll build this color up. This dark purple it's a dark color. Yeah, it's called dark purple, but it is a dark color. It does not take a whole lot to get darkness and depth with this pencil. So instead of going in with one heavy layer, I'm just going to go back and forth and build this up until I get the color that I'm looking for. And I don't want this to read purple. At the end of the day, this is a red capped mushroom. So I do want it to read red, and so I need to kind of be a little careful with my dark purple in that. So I'm going to go around the edge of this first, and then I'll work my way towards the center. And the only reason why I'm doing that is because I want to make sure that I get all of these. I don't want to skip any. By the time the colored pencil work is done, you're going to be able to tell those that have been reinforced with the colored pencil and those that haven't. The ones that haven't are going to look much lighter than the ones that have. This dark purple is really going to reinforce the cast shadow on those warts. You can see already how much more those stand out. It's almost like they just pop up as soon as I add that dark purple to them. So by keeping myself on track here, and by working from one starting point towards the center, I can make sure that I'm not going to miss any of those, and everything will look perfect and cohesive when I'm done with it. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to speed this up because it's really, really simple, folks. I just get up underneath or right to the edge of that wart, and then I start working that dark purple out in very, very light-handed circular motions. I don't bring it out too far. In fact, I can see where that BV20 and the R17 together, I can see where that transitions into just the R17. So I stop at that point and then I move on to the next wart. I did take a peek at this real quick and I decided I could go in just a wee bit darker along those edges there. I do want to make sure that I have a really good base of this dark purple down before I move on to the poppy red, which I'm going to do right now. Again, sharp pencil, light hand. I'm going right over the top of that dark purple and I'm bringing it out just barely past the R17 coloring. It might be hard to see here on the video, but in real life, I can see that. So I'm seeing the BV20 with the R17 over it, then the R17, and then just the R14. So I bring it just past that R17, and when I get to that point, I really lighten up the pressure on my pencil. In fact, you can see even now how far back I'm holding my fingers from the end of the pencil, and I'm doing that because this is going to allow me to get that super duper light pressure. Now, poppy red Prismacolor and R17 and R14 are really, really close. You kind of have to do some looking here in order to see the difference in them. Sometimes I can look at it like down there at the left hand side of the mushroom. I can see that poppy red, but in real life, not so much. This is a really good color to get that smooth transition. Plus, it takes that dark purple to a darker red when you go over the top of it. So this is ideal, but I don't want it to color over the entire cap of the mushroom. That R14 is my target color, and I don't need to recolor the whole entire thing. So I am kind of working through this fairly quickly at this point. It's super easy to do, but I'm also making sure and paying attention to where my colors are transitioning on the image itself. Okay, so I'm going to speed this up here, folks, because it really is that easy. I'm just going to continue to build this up until I get the color that I want, keeping in mind that I don't want to go too heavy or too dark in any one particular area. Note how far back I'm holding that pencil. Again, this ensures that I'm getting a really super light coverage here, and that's exactly what I'm shooting for. I'm also not going to show you how I color in the other two caps. It's identical to what I'm doing here. I didn't think that it was necessary to go over it again, and I really have nothing new to say about it, so I will work on those off camera. In the meantime, I'm going to move on to coloring in the stems. I have the indigo blue Prismacolor pencil. I'm just kind of barely covering the edge of where I would see the darkest portion of the skirt, just very, very lightly. It gives it just enough definition in that area that you can see the overall movement of it. And then I'm going to bring in this Prussian green. This goes in where I would have had that YG03. And it just pushes it back just a little bit further. Again, it gives me a little bit more definition in that area. And then I'm going to blend that just a tiny, tiny bit with the Prismacolor in the spring green. This is just a very, very light coat of this. I'm actually pretty light-handed, and I'm actually not even covering up all of my Copic color there. Just barely going in there with that. And then I'm going to call that good. Now I have my dark purple again, and I have a very sharp point on this. You can see the areas of that skirt that is lifted up away from the mushroom stem itself. That is where I'm adding this dark purple, just a tiny bit of it. And then I'm coming in with this burnt ochre, and I'm going right over the top of that, and I'll bring it out just a little bit. Now at this point, I am starting to cover up some of that stippling. I suppose if you look just right, maybe close one eye and hold your tongue off to the side, you might be able to see some of the stippling underneath there, but it's not a big deal. I just kind of want to reinforce some of that shade in there with that burnt ochre, and I don't care about the stippling. It's not a biggie. I had that dark purple again up underneath the stem, just barely where that cap meets the stem, just a tiny bit. And then I'm going to go over the top of that with the dark brown, bring that out a little bit. Now I'm coming in again with that burnt ochre. I'm going right over the top of that dark purple and the dark brown and bringing that out pretty much in a very light circular motion. They're not very tight circles. I'm just kind of bringing it out a tiny bit. I felt like I needed a little bit more of that burnt ochre down here underneath that skirt. And then as I looked at that line between the skirt and the stem, I felt like that needed just a tiny bit of this dark brown, but not a whole lot, just a very light, thin line there. So I want these to look like they are separated away from the stem. So I'm taking that dark purple and I'm going right there where I have the lightest portion of the line itself and the darkest portion. So where that E40 butts up right next to that E43. Super sharp pencil again, folks, and a really, really light hand. I'm just barely putting any of this on the paper, and I'll go back and forth over the top of it until I get it a little bit darker, and then I'll bring in my dark brown, go over the top of that and bring that out a little bit. I wish I could show you what it feels like for the amount of pressure that I have on this. They're dark pencils by nature, so I don't need a lot of pressure, but I definitely don't want to go too dark with them. So I can just barely feel my pencil skimming the surface of that paper. I also brought in a little bit of that burnt ochre to kind of blend that in a little bit, and I'll take this burnt ochre just barely over the darkest portions of the bends and folds within that skirt. Then I'm pretty much going to call that good. For the colored pencil work on these stems, I just went back and forth with all three of my pencils, kind of played around with them until I got it to where I wanted it. I kind of was one of those coloring experiences where I'm kind of going for the feel as opposed to one thing after another, one step after another. And I do the same thing on all three of these stems. So I'm not going to show you all three of those, but I am going to show you this cap. I have the Prismacolor dark brown. I want to get right up underneath the lip of this cap where it meets the underneath of it, and kind of reinforce that a little bit. I did notice on the reference photo that there is kind of a little bit of a divot there that runs across the line or the lip of that cap. So I'm adding the shading in there, bringing it in from the edge a little bit on that right hand side. I need to reinforce some of the shade right here on this side where that skirt is overhanging it. Now I feel technically this mushroom would be far enough back that there might not be any direct cast shadow, but I loved the look of that depth and shadow right there because it really separated that skirt from the bottom side of this mushroom. I'm also going to add a little bit of this dark brown here around the top of the stem. Now, I do want to be careful here and make sure that I'm not adding too much of it because I do have some of that dark purple and dark brown at the top of that stem where it meets that cap. So if I go too dark in that area, they're going to look like they blend in and I'm going to lose that depth. It's going to lose that 3-dimension where it looks like the bottom of this cap is being pushed up with the stem. So I'm trying to be super careful in there. Now, I did not add any of that dark purple underneath the cap surrounding that stem, just on the stem itself. So there's going to be a little bit of color variation in that by itself, but you could easily go too dark in that and still lose the definition, even not using the dark purple. So I am keeping that in mind. I did want to add a little bit more of this burnt ochre. It does warm it up just a little bit. It kind of gives it a little bit of a toasty look, I suppose. And I also went over those gills with this as well. So I have that peach Stettler, then I have the brown of the Copic, and then I'm adding the burnt ochre over the top of it. It kind of softens those just a wee bit, gives it a little bit more of an organic look, and I preferred that so much better. So I'm going to do the same thing with the stems here as I did with the caps on those mushrooms. I'm just going to kind of go back and forth with my colors and kind of tweak it a little bit, add more color where I feel I need to add more color, but I'm definitely self-checking in between adding more color. I don't want to get out of control and ruin my coloring altogether. I'm also going to bring this dark brown in, and I'm going in where I had that E11. I felt like after it dried, it wasn't quite dark enough. I did look at the reference photo, and some of those actually go pretty dark in the middle of these warts. So I'm going to use this dark brown to get that effect. And again, it's just kind of sloppy, folks. None of it is perfect. I'm just getting that color in there. I do want this to look organic as well, because it would be in nature. So I'm just going to get this in there and call it good. I will go over the top of these with the Prismacolor in cream. I don't believe I added that to the supply list. So if I didn't add that, and if you don't have the cream Prismacolor, don't even worry about it. You could get away with just bringing in this dark brown and leaving it, and it would be just fine. I brought that cream in just to kind of blend it out a little bit, to kind of allow those waxes to kind of mix just a little bit. I put just enough pressure on it that that dark brown underneath it was kind of, well, it was being pushed around by the lighter color of the cream, and that was perfect, I think. But you could skip this part if you absolutely want to. Also, there's on some reference photos that I looked at, there are some of them that have this very, very light edge that runs around the lip of the cap of the mushrooms. And I tested out several things when I was doing my color swatches. I decided to leave that off. There was nothing that I could find that I was really happy with. Although I think the look is really cool. I love that look. I just couldn't come up with anything that felt right to me. If you decide to color in this image, that is definitely something to keep in mind. You could definitely play around with it, see if you come up with something. I wasn't happy with white colored pencils. This beige colored pencil didn't work. Cream didn't work. A gel pen was definitely too stark. I tried all sorts of things. It just didn't work out for me, but you could definitely give it a shot. Maybe you can come up with something and then you can share it with us all here. That would be super duper. All right, so I'm going to finish this grass here real quick. This was super duper easy. I have the Prismacolor in indigo blue. Again, I'm going right in there where I would have had that B34, but I'm not going in as heavy with this as I did the B34, primarily because my pencil is thinner and sharper. This is going to help get me some cleaner edges in here. It will add a little bit more definition back into these blades of grass, but overall, I'm not terribly worried about it. The only thing I'm really trying to accomplish here, folks, is to get those darker greens to push back even darker. The indigo blue will help me do that. I don't need the detail. I just need the depth and I need the shade in order for this to look like. Plus, you got to keep in mind, I have all of my colored pencil work done around this grass, so I need to match the level of shades in this grass to the rest of my image, or they're not going to look right. Also, as I'm adding in this indigo blue, I'm making sure that I'm getting it down there at the base of those blades of grass. I'm just going in with really tight circular motions, kind of building that up a little bit. I wanted to make sure that that area is darker because it should be more dense the closer you get to the ground. So I want to push that back a little bit further, make that darker in there, build up that color, and then it's going to look thicker. When I'm done with that indigo blue, I'm going to come in with the Prussian green. Now, at this point, you should still see plenty of your YG03. I'm not completely coloring over all of these blades of grass. Now, I am going to come in with this Prussian green right here in between those mushrooms, and I am going to color in all of that portion that's actually directly in between those mushrooms. And I'm doing that because it'll kind of dirty them up a little little bit. That's going to be a darker area in there for one thing. Not dark enough that it needs the indigo blue, but darker that I can go in with that amount of Prussian green. But also because it is in between the two of them, you wouldn't necessarily be able to see it that well. You wouldn't have a lot of detail in there, so I can dirty that up with that Prussian green. Now I want to add a few highlights in here, kind of brighten up some of these edges, so I'm coming in with the spring green. I'm sorry that it's off camera there, but also I had those flicks running out the sides of the grass with a Copic marker, so I did those shorter flicks off to the side a little bit. I'm adding some of that the spring green in there as well in flicking motions to help build that up a little bit more and brighten that area up just a teensy weensy bit. And then I'm going to call that good. If I weren't putting this in a frame, I would actually add maybe some Sakura clear glaze pen to the warts on this. I think that would be a lot of fun. Some Nouveau Aqua Shimmer to the highlights of those warts would also be really fun. Plus you could add maybe that to the highlights of the blades of grass. That could be really groovy, but I am just going to call it good. And that is it, folks. We are done. We are good to go. I have more links down in the description below, as well as in today's post on Patreon. Remember, there is a PDF available with a detailed supply list, so do be sure to check that out. I hope you enjoyed my project today. If you did, hit that like button here and on Patreon. Also be sure to leave me a comment because I love to hear from you. Thanks again so much for joining me. Until next time.